Well, hello everyone, and welcome back once again to our journey down the road to somewhere. If you happen to just be joining us or jumping in, I might just remind everyone what we're trying to accomplish. We're taking a journey down Route 66, and we're using my latest book, The Road to Somewhere, which is a story about a couple traveling down Route 66, filming some short videos that go with 66, you could almost call them lectures, one on each book of the Bible. And what we're doing is giving sort of a brief little history of whatever town that we're stopping at, 66 stops along Route 66, and then just a little bit of what you might almost think of as a teaser to the biblical book that is connected to that town in the story. And then encouraging people to go to that other video, and you have a link to that either in your email or on your Facebook page. So anyway, if you are joining us, we welcome you, and we are in season 4, kind of the fourth leg of our trip, and we are in the state of Oklahoma on Route 66. And sort of the part of the Bible that is attached to Route 66 in our story are the books of the prophets. And so we are beginning by going through the 5 books of what are called the major prophets. And we're in our third session of 5 in the major prophets. And we're going to be looking a little bit at the book of Lamentations today. I think the theme of what today's, particularly the biblical story, but actually really the Route 66 story is about, is I'm going to call devastation, and we'll see why that is as we move along today. So again, we've been through 3 states. We're in our 4th state now, state of Oklahoma, and again, we'll be making a total of 17 stops in that state, because there are 17 books of prophecy in the Old Testament. And today, as we head down the road, this is we're still sort of up in this northeast little quadrant of the state of Oklahoma. Last time we were in the little town of Miami. And for those of you that got my email this week, you'll know that I pointed out 2 mistakes that I made in the video. I don't know how many of you caught it. You probably would have had to be from Oklahoma to catch the first, which is that there's a tendency, because the town's name is spelled like the Florida town of Miami, but the pronunciation, the local pronunciation, is Miami. And second mistake I made was that twice, looking back at the video, I referred to the destruction of Jerusalem that we're dealing with now, that took place in 586. I mentioned that it was the Romans that had destroyed the city, and what I meant to say was the Babylonians. So I actually made a couple of mistakes there, and hopefully we got that cleared up. Today we're going to head down the road, and we're actually coming to a little town in Oklahoma called Afton. And again, the biblical book that is attached to this stop is the book of Lamentations. It's interesting, by the way, Lamentations has been called the saddest book in the Bible. And as we move through our little time together today, you will probably see why that is. So in the book, as they're shooting this little video, John and Joy again have left Miami, and they've driven down to Afton, only about 15 miles down the road from Miami to Afton. And there's really kind of an immense contrast between those 2 towns. Although Miami wasn't real big, I think the population we saw was, around 13,000, something like that. It's actually kind of a thriving town. It's taken good advantage of the fact that it was on Route 66. When you get to Afton, it's quite a bit different. The population of Afton these days is only 794 people, and Afton, it's almost dead. It's really not a thriving town. Isn't quite a ghost town. There are some of those along Route 66, but again, the reason that Afton has been in decline for so many years is that it was bypassed by the Interstate 44, when that was built, and consequently, many of the travelers that traveled Route 66 no longer go through the town of Afton, and so it's just not what you would think of as a thriving place these days. I have to tell you, it's a little bit humorous because as I was doing some research on Afton, I ran across this article, and the title of the article was the 15 small towns everyone should visit in Oklahoma. And Afton was one of them. Now, this had to be written a couple of years ago because Afton actually used to have one of the major Route 66 attractions, and that was that there was a restored old DX gas station, and part of what it was restored to do was that the people that owned it had also turned it into a museum for Packards and Studebakers. The owners were collectors of these two models of cars. You can kind of see an old bullet nose Studebaker there on the right-hand side of the picture. And so this became a good place to stop, and I think the reason why it was included in that list. Unfortunately, when the owners died, they shut down this gift shop and museum, and consequently, there's really not a lot to stop and see in Afton. But John and Joy decide they're going to go ahead and pull in underneath the portico of the filling station, and Joy just decides that would be a sort of a good looking location to shoot their little video. So John begins, as they begin to shoot the video in the book, he begins by identifying their location, of course, and he tells a little bit about the station and the museum and how Interstate 44 ruined the town. One of the things that stuck out to me, by the way, as I was doing a little bit of research on the town, is that thinking back on a lot of these small towns that the interstate has sort of ruined in some ways or devastated. Ironically, it was Route 66 that was the reason that they had been sort of prosperous and thriving, because they tended to be tourist stops, as anytime tourists were traveling from Los Angeles east toward Chicago, or Chicago west toward Los Angeles, many of these little towns would be where they stopped. So Route 66 made the town, Interstate 44 ruined the town. And what John does then in the little video as they're shooting it is that he uses this theme of devastation and ties it into the book of the prophets that goes with Afton, and that is the book of Lamentations. Lamentations in the Protestant and Catholic Bibles is again included with the major prophets, primarily because even though the book itself doesn't identify authorship, traditionally it's always been identified as having been written by Jeremiah, and in certain versions of the Bible it was even attached to the end of the prophecy of Jeremiah. In the Hebrew Bible, it's not part of the prophets. It's part of what are called the writings. And you might remember back when we looked at Song of Songs and Ecclesiastes and even the book of Esther, that there was within this section of the Hebrew Bible called the writings, there were 5 scrolls that were called the 5 scrolls, the megalith. And they were 5 books, actually 5 scrolls that were read at certain major feasts. So, for instance, Song of Songs was read every year at Passover, Esther at Purim, because that's really the story of Esther, and Ecclesiastes during the Feast of Tabernacles. So this was one of those books, and this book was read every year on the Hebrew day, the 9th day of the Hebrew month of Av, because that was the day that the Jews had sort of dated as the day that the temple was destroyed. And this is a book that is a lament over the destruction of the temple. We call it Lamentations because it is a lament, which means an expression of grief and sorrow. In the Hebrew Bible, oftentimes the books were simply named based on either the first word of the text or something in the first phrase of the text. And the first word in the text of this book is the word how. And it is part of the kind of the opening sentence of the book, where the person, probably Jeremiah, simply says, "How deserted lies the city, once so full of people." And again, this is what this book is going to be about. It was probably written right at 586 BC. We'll look at that in a minute. But basically, John gives a little bit of background in the book as they're taping this video. And he tells the story of how in some manuscripts it was attached to Jeremiah. He talks about why it's part of the major prophets. And again, he kind of explains what a lament is. I didn't put it in the book, or I did put it in the book, I think. Can't remember. That I think John makes mention of what the first line of the book should have been is, "I told you so." Because again, everything that Jeremiah had prophesied and warned the nation of Judah about has come to pass. And the sense you get as you read through the book is that Jeremiah is writing this as he's looking at just this destroyed and devastated city. I mean, the Romans have knocked the walls to the ground. They have burned down the temple. They basically have destroyed the entire city. You know, I was thinking just, as you watch the news lately and we see some of these horrible disasters that have taken place, you look at what Gaza looks like these days in terms of the level of destruction, or you think about Asheville, North Carolina, and how floods have just completely annihilated this town, or the fire a year ago in Lanai in Hawaii, or probably the most comparable scenario would be take a look at a picture of Hiroshima after the atomic bomb has been dropped, and it's just devastated completely, and that's what happened to Jerusalem. And it was overwhelming, really, to almost any Jew that this could ever happen to Jerusalem. I mean, when you think about it, this was what their whole belief system was built around, that somehow they were the chosen people, the descendants of Abraham, and that Jerusalem was the holy city, the city of David, and the temple was the place where God had manifested himself. And the thinking had to be, something like this could never have happened. And yet that's what Jeremiah had prophesied, other prophets the same, and now we're seeing it. We're seeing that here's Jeremiah, and he's looking out over the city that the Babylonians, under the leadership of Nebuchadnezzar, have just absolutely destroyed the city. We think about 588. The Babylonians started their siege of the city. They surrounded it. No one could come in. No one could go out. It would lead to starvation, all kinds of desperation inside of a city that was under siege. And then finally, in 586, they broke through the walls. By the way, I wanted to share this with you. The Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, it actually added an introduction to the book. So rather than starting with that phrase, how desolate lies the city, the Septuagint began by saying, and it came to pass after Israel had been taken into captivity and Jerusalem laid waste, that Jeremiah sat weeping and uttered this lament over Jerusalem. So again, we get this idea that it's almost as if Jeremiah is right there looking at what has happened and is grieving over it. And so if you read the book, first of all, I really hope you'll watch the video on Lamentations. I go into quite a bit of detail on it. But if you read the book, what you find is that there are 5 chapters, so it's relatively short, and the 5 chapters are composed of 5 poems. So it's a poetic book. It's also structured in an interesting way, because one form of Hebrew poetry was that they would write verses with what you would think of as an alphabetic acrostic. In other words, the first verse would always begin with a word that started with the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, Aleph, and then the second verse would have, the second letter of the Hebrew alphabet, Beit, and then the third would have the third Hebrew letter, Gimel, the fourth, Dalet, and so on, so that there are 22 verses in 4 of the 5 chapters. There are 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet, and so that each of those 4 chapters simply follows that pattern. The middle chapter has 66 verses, and what it does is it has 3 sets of alphabetic acrostic in it. So it follows this same pattern. It's just quite a bit longer. There is one bright spot. Again, 586 BC, the date of the destruction and probably the date of the writing. There is one little bit of hope in the book, and it's a very famous line, if not even thought of as a verse, but I'm not sure how many people know that it comes from the book of Lamentations. But in the middle of looking at this destruction and these poems of just despair, there is this one, at least, little hint of hope. And Jeremiah writes this, but this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. He says, because of the steadfast love of the Lord, we are not consumed. His mercies never come to an end. Now, understand there is sort of a remnant that's left. There's the exiles that have been deported, which Jeremiah says in 70 years are coming back. Unlike the northern kingdom that was completely devastated, what Jeremiah is saying here is that even in light of everything that has happened, we are not completely consumed because of God's steadfast love. And then he goes on and he says this, that his steadfast love is new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. And of course, we have this great hymn called Great is Thy Faithfulness. And it's really the title of that, and the chorus of that is taken from this passage in Lamentations. So again, just a little bit of hope. One chapter where John doesn't point, one chapter in the book. This is one chapter in the book where John actually doesn't point his audience to the longer and more comprehensive video on Lamentations, but I'm going to point you toward that because, again, the purpose of the book and the purpose of our videos that we're doing, our little episodes every week, is hopefully to get you then to go on and you have a link to a longer 45-minute teaching overview of the book of Lamentations, and there's so much more that's contained in that than what is contained either in the book or in these little episodes that we do every week. So I'd encourage you to watch it. You have a link in your email if you're on the email list, or on Facebook you have a link to that longer video. So I'd encourage you to look at that. Next stop on our journey down Route 66 we'll be going to the town of Claremore, which is about an hour drive. So we're going to have some time for John and Joy to interact with each other on that part of the trip. And then the Old Testament book, or the major prophet that is connected to the town of Claremore, is the wild prophet Ezekiel, probably one of the wildest books in the Old Testament, and the visions that Ezekiel has and recorded. So we'll have a good time together on that next week. So thanks for joining in, and again, we'll look forward to seeing you next week.